Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This week, it feels like every time I refresh my news feed, there's another crazy headline coming out of the White House.
Yeah, I've been seeing the same thing. It's been a quite a week.
So let's just dive right in and try to process all this together. Um, One of the biggest things that jumped out was this national energy emergency that the president declared.
Right, and he seems to be using that to really push through a lot of energy projects and potentially even bypass certain environmental regulations.
Yeah, and then there's Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Now he's the nation's top health official, and some of his first moves as health secretary are already causing a lot of controversy.
Definitely. It's certainly an interesting choice. And then we have Elon Musk, who's now saying he wants to bring down the International Space Station in 2 years.
Yeah, and we can't forget about Steve Bannon's appearance at CPAC. I mean, did he just give a Nazi salute on stage?
It certainly looked that way. It's a lot to unpack. So where should we start?
Well, I think we have to start with Elon Musk and this Department of Government Efficiency that he's running. It's called DOGE, and they've been tasked with cutting government spending and streamlining bureaucracy. But their approach has been, well, let's just say aggressive.
Yeah, they've been canceling contracts left and right, claiming to save billions of dollars. But an NPR analysis suggests some of those numbers might be a little inflated.
For example, they were bragging about canceling this $8 billion ICE contract. Like,
Yeah.
they were saying it was a huge victory, but the potential savings there were actually much closer to $4.5 million.
Right. It seems like their focus is just on making these big dramatic cuts to save money as quickly as possible, and they're not really thinking about the long-term consequences, or even if these cuts are actually going to make the government more efficient.
Yeah, like what about the people who are losing their jobs because of these cuts? We can't just ignore the human cost of all this. What about that park ranger, Stacey Ramsey? She was fired despite her crucial role in search and rescue efforts.
Right, exactly. These are essential government services that people rely on.
And on top of all that, there are concerns about DOGE trying to access sensitive taxpayer data at the IRS.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. They're requesting access to data systems at the Department of Health and Human Services, too. And that's raising some serious privacy concerns. People are starting to wonder if DOGE is really just trying to streamline bureaucracy or if they have some other motives.
It's not surprising that multiple lawsuits have been filed challenging DOGE's authority. People are arguing that such drastic restructuring requires more oversight and due process. I mean, are DOGE's actions even legal?
That's what the courts will have to decide. But it does highlight a really important point. There needs to be more transparency and accountability with DOGE. Right now, they're just kind of operating in the shadows, and that's making a lot of people nervous.
For sure. So let's shift gears a bit and talk about the president's declaration of a national energy emergency. What exactly does that even mean? And what are the implications of this?
Well, he's basically using it as justification to expedite energy projects and potentially bypass environmental regulations. It's a pretty bold move, and some people are saying it's an overreach of executive power.
What's particularly alarming is that he's suggesting he might use eminent domain, or the Defense Production Act, to fast-track these projects. What does that mean for people who might be in the way of these projects?
Eminent domain is the government's power to seize private property for public use, even if the owner doesn't want to sell. And the Defense Production Act allows the president to direct private companies to prioritize government contracts, even if it disrupts their normal operations. So yeah, if he starts using those powers to push through these energy projects, it could have some pretty serious consequences.
It sounds like this energy emergency declaration gives the president a lot of power. What kind of precedent does this set for future presidents?
That's a good question. It's not the first time a president has used emergency powers, but the scope of this declaration and the way he seems to be willing to use it is definitely concerning. It makes you wonder what other powers he might try to grab in the future.
And it's not just the energy sector where he's asserting his authority. He issued an executive order requiring independent agencies to submit regulations for White House review. And then there was that whole clash with the governor of Maine over the executive order barring transgender athletes from girls' sports teams. He even told her to enjoy her life after being governor. Is this how a president is supposed to act?
Well, it's certainly not how we expect presidents to behave. It raises some serious questions about his respect for the rule of law and the separation of powers. He seems to be trying to consolidate power and control everything, which is not how our government is supposed to work.
It's like he doesn't even care about checks and balances or the limits on presidential power.
I think it's important to avoid making any judgments about his intentions or motivations. We need to stick to the facts and analyze his actions carefully. But it is concerning to see him behaving this way.
You're right. We need to be careful not to get caught up in the hype and speculation. We need to focus on the facts and what we know for sure. And there's still a lot to uncover here.
And speaking of concerning actions, we really need to talk about the ultimatum the president gave to Europe regarding Ukraine.
Right. He gave them 3 weeks to agree on terms for Ukraine to surrender, or the U.S. will withdraw from Europe. It sounds like something out of a movie.
It does. It's incredibly bold, and a lot of people are saying it's reckless. What are these surrender terms anyway, and what happens to Ukraine if they agree to them?
Well, the reports are saying the terms involve Ukraine giving up territory and abandoning its goal of joining NATO. Basically, it seems like the U.S. is trying to force a settlement that benefits Russia. And it's really upsetting a lot of our European allies.
Not to mention Ukraine. I mean, Zelensky is furious. He feels like Ukraine is being left out of the discussions about its own future. It's a pretty big blow to their sovereignty.
And how are our allies reacting? Are they on board with this plan?
Not really. A lot of European leaders are expressing serious doubts about the U.S. commitment to NATO if they're willing to just abandon Ukraine like this. And they're worried about the precedent this sets for future conflicts. What's to stop Russia from going after another country if they know the U.S. might not back them up?
It seems like the president is alienating our allies at a time when we really need to be working together.
Exactly. Global stability is more important now than ever. And this kind of unpredictable behavior from the U.S. is not helping.
Well, on a slightly lighter note, Elon Musk has been causing his own brand of international chaos this week.
Oh, yeah, that whole Twitter feud with the astronauts. I mean, accusing NASA of leaving astronauts on the space station for political reasons. That was something else.
Yeah, it seems like Elon Musk is always finding new and interesting ways to make headlines. Speaking of Musk, I don't know if you saw this, but Grimes made a public plea on Twitter saying he's ignoring their child's medical crisis.
Wow, I hadn't seen that. That's
Yeah.
pretty concerning. I hope everything turns out okay.
Yeah, me too. But going back to what you were saying earlier about the president's actions, are there any checks and balances in place to prevent this kind of potential overreach?
Well, there are supposed to be. The system is designed to prevent any one person from having too much power, but it only works if people are willing to use it.
So what are some examples of those checks and balances being used in this case?
Well, for one, you have all the lawsuits being filed against DOGE and the president's executive orders. Those are people using the legal system to challenge what they see as an abuse of power.
Right. And then you have people like the acting commissioner of the Social Security Administration who resigned because he didn't agree with DOGE trying to access recipient information. That's a pretty powerful statement.
Absolutely. He was willing to sacrifice his own career to stand up for what he believed was right. That takes courage.
It does. So even though it might seem like the president has unlimited power, there's still people pushing back and trying to hold him accountable.
Yeah, and that's really important. It's what keeps our democracy functioning, even when things seem chaotic and out of control.
Speaking of chaotic, did you see what happened at CPAC with Steve Bannon?
Yeah, that apparent Nazi salute on stage, that was chilling. It really makes you wonder what's going on with political discourse in this country.
It does feel like things are getting more extreme and divisive.
Yeah, and we need to be careful about normalizing that kind of rhetoric. It's dangerous, and it can lead to real-world harm.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from international ultimatums to Twitter feuds to potential Nazi salutes. It's been a wild ride.
Yeah, no kidding. It's a lot to process, and it can be really overwhelming to try and keep up with everything that's happening.
It really can. So before we wrap up, I want to bring it back to our listeners. For everyone out there trying to make sense of all this, what does it all actually mean for you? How could these actions potentially affect your everyday life?
Well, it's definitely a lot for anyone to try and wrap their heads around. I mean, we've talked about everything from government overreach and controversial appointments to international conflicts and potential economic turmoil. It's a lot to take in.
It really is. And it's easy to feel overwhelmed by it all. But I think it's important to step back and think about the big picture. What does all of this mean for the future of our country? Like, what are the long-term consequences of these actions?
Well, one thing that worries me is the erosion of trust in our institutions. When the government starts acting in ways that seem arbitrary or self-serving, it makes people lose faith in the system. It makes them question whether the government is really working for them or just for a select few.
And that loss of trust can be really hard to rebuild.
Right, absolutely. And then you have the increasing political polarization and division that we're seeing. It feels like everyone's retreating into their own echo chambers, and it's becoming harder and harder to have productive conversations about the issues.
Yeah, it's like we can't even agree on basic facts anymore, let alone how to solve complex problems.
And that's a real danger to democracy. Democracy depends on dialogue and compromise. When we lose the ability to listen to each other and find common ground, it weakens the fabric of our society.
So given all of this, what can we as individuals do? How can we navigate this complex and often unsettling landscape?
Well, the first thing is to stay informed. Don't just rely on one source of news. Get your information from a variety of sources and be critical of what you read. Think about the biases of the source and the agenda they might be pushing.
Right. Don't just accept everything you see at face value. Do your own research and form your own opinions.
Exactly. And it's also important to get involved in your community and engage with your elected officials. Make your voice heard, let them know what issues you care about, and hold them accountable for their actions.
And don't be afraid to reach out to people who have different views than you. Try to have respectful conversations and understand where they're coming from. Even if you don't agree, you might learn something.
That's so important. And remember, you're not alone in feeling overwhelmed or concerned. There are a lot of people out there who share your values and are working to make a difference. Find those people. Connect with them. Support organizations that are fighting for the causes you believe in.
And most importantly, don't give up. It's easy to feel powerless in the face of these huge challenges. But every action we take, no matter how small, can make a difference.
Right. It's all about reclaiming our agency, engaging in thoughtful dialogue, and working together to build a better future.
And I think that's a great place to leave it. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to ask you one final question. What stood out to you the most from our conversation? What questions are still lingering in your mind? And what actions will you take to stay informed, engaged, and empowered in the weeks and months ahead?
It's been a great conversation. And remember, the deep dive doesn't end here. It's an ongoing process of learning, reflecting, and engaging with the world around us.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep asking those tough questions.